Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to the channel. Nate Diaz recently did an interview with Ariel Helwani on the MMA Hour, and it's an hour and 20-minute interview. I'll link it down in the description if you guys want to check out the full interview. But basically, people are trying to watch this interview and decipher what's really going on behind the scenes with Nate Diaz and the UFC. So I figured I'd make a video giving my thoughts on this entire situation. There's so much to unpack with this situation, but I'm going to answer the questions. What does Nate Diaz want? What does the UFC want? How does Nate Diaz and the UFC resolve? What's going to be the final resolution of this, in my opinion? And we're also going to talk about the history of Nate Diaz in the UFC. There's been contract dispute after contract dispute. Some of them have been so long ago that I think a lot of people have forgotten about them. We're going to talk about that briefly. We're also going to talk about how the UFC contracts are basically holding these fighters hostage. And there's just so much to discuss. We're going to talk about vindictive matchmaking. There's so much to try to fit into a 10-15 minute interview. And I'm also going to talk about a hypothetical scenario that I've seen people floating around online about how Nate Diaz could potentially screw the UFC. I think it's very doubtful, but we're going to talk about that as well in this video. So first off, some history on Nate Diaz, because I feel like a lot of people, are newer to the sport, and some of this stuff has just faded into the back of the minds of people who have been watching for a long time. Nate Diaz has had contract dispute after contract dispute after contract dispute with the UFC. It's happened time and time again. Nate Diaz has suffered from some vindictive matchmaking from the UFC in the past as well. We're going to talk about that. And this is only what I know. I haven't even been watching the UFC for as long as Nate Diaz has been in the UFC. He's been in the UFC since 2007. So I'm going to start off from where I remember. After Nate Diaz got a massive main event win at a fight night against Gray Maynard, who was one of the top-ranked lightweights back in 2013, November 30th, there was a contract dispute after that. And he was talking about he wanted more money, and the UFC was kind of going back and forth. And eventually, I think they gave him a little bit of an increase. I think he still wasn't happy. I don't remember exactly how it resolved, but I do know it resolved with a year, or actually it was 13 months later. They had Nate Diaz return against prime, or starting to find his way to his prime, Rafael dos Anjos. We know what that was, okay? The UFC wanted him to get brutalized, and in that fight, Nate Diaz got brutalized. And another thing I want to mention, I feel like this is a false narrative that goes around, constantly. People just keep repeating it and repeating it and repeating it, because this fighter, I'm talking about a different fighter, not Nate Diaz, that has a cult-like following, who said it himself. A lot of people say Conor McGregor made Nate Diaz. That's not true at all. First off, don't get me wrong. Conor McGregor helped elevate Nate Diaz's star power. And I know years ago, Dana White said, Nate Diaz doesn't move the needle. Go look that up if you don't believe it. He said that at one point about Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz has always been cared about by the fans. That's why they had him in that main event against Gray Maynard. That's why they threw him on notable cards. That's why they gave him a title shot against Benson Henderson back in the day. People care about Nate Diaz, and they cared about him long before Conor McGregor. And I get it. His stock elevated after that win in those two fights. But Nate Diaz was still very, very popular and had a cult-like following of his own long before that fight. But anyway, contract dispute. Then he fights Rafael dos Anjos. Then we had another contract dispute. He was out for another year. He came back. He fought Michael Johnson. He destroyed Michael Johnson. A lot of people thought he was going to lose that fight against Michael Johnson going in. A lot of people thought Michael Johnson's going to beat the brakes off of Nate Diaz. I'm sure there's some people that thought Nate Diaz was going to win, but there was the majority of people thought that Michael Johnson was going to be a bad matchup for Nate, especially considering he's only had one fight in 2 years up until this point. So he goes out there and puts on a masterclass performance against Michael Johnson. And what does he do afterwards? He calls out 145-pound champion Conor McGregor. Conor had just won the belt off of Jose Aldo. We didn't really know what was going to happen with Conor McGregor at this point. I don't think it was known, because this was only a couple days, couple weeks max after Conor defeated Jose Aldo. We didn't even know he was going to fight for the lightweight title. And Nate Diaz was calling him out. And this was one of the most, historical call-outs on the mic. They bleeped it because I think it was on Fox. But anyway, he beats Michael Johnson. He calls out Conor McGregor. Everyone thought there's no way he gets the Conor McGregor fight. Conor McGregor was the golden goose for the UFC at this time. And what happens? Conor McGregor ends up getting the RDA fight. RDA is the champion, lightweight champion at this point in time. And Conor gets the RDA fight. It's supposed to happen in March. RDA, I think he broke his foot. He pulls out of the fight. And guess who steps in on 11 days notice? And guess who gets a new contract to step in on 11 days notice against Conor McGregor? Nate Diaz. What the UFC did not plan on was Nate Diaz winning that fight. Nate Diaz wins that fight. He chokes out Conor McGregor in the second round. Crazy performance. I actually picked Nate Diaz in this fight. Goes out there and chokes out the golden goose of the UFC, Dana White's pet, Conor McGregor. What a crazy win to come in. You know, he was on vacation, and he comes in, accepts his short notice fight. It was at 170, and he beats Conor McGregor, who a lot of people thought, oh, he's going to be double champ, which he eventually did become double champ. People could not believe it. They were like, what is next? And Nate Diaz, after he won that fight, a lot of people wanted to see Conor McGregor go back down to 145. They said, oh, he's got to go back down to 145. He lost to Nate Diaz. And Conor, I respect it. He begged for the Nate Diaz rematch. He said, no. The UFC, I don't think the UFC wanted to book it. A lot of the media was saying, oh, this isn't a good idea for Conor because if he loses again, he's screwed. Conor McGregor insisted on fighting Nate Diaz again. He fights him at UFC 202. I believe Nate Diaz got another contract for this. I'm not 100% sure, but that's besides the point. They rematch. It was a very competitive fight. Conor McGregor wins a decision. That was a very risky fight for Conor McGregor because if he lost twice, then what does he do? So Nate gets paid. Those two huge Conor fights. Nate gets paid a large sum of money for both of them. Then he sits out for 3 years. 3 years. And it was talked about after Conor won because the rematch was a very close fight that could have gone either way. There was talk of a potential trilogy, but it never came to fruition. Conor went on to beat Eddie Alvarez, then go box Floyd Mayweather. And, Conor in 2016, that's his last win at lightweight. It's 6 years later, that's his last win at lightweight. But anyway, Nate Diaz sits out. He talks about he wants a big fight, this and that. He sits out for 3 years. He finally comes back and fights Anthony Pettis at UFC 241. And for those of you who don't remember, a lot of people thought Anthony Pettis was a bad matchup for him at the time. I know, Anthony Pettis hasn't been doing that good of late in PFL and whatnot. But a lot of people thought, oh, the kicks of Anthony Pettis are going to be terrible for Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz goes out there, out-wrestles him, beats him by decision, and calls out the hottest name in the sport at the time, Jorge Masvidal, who had just flying kneed Ben Askren into oblivion. And he conjures up a main event against Jorge Masvidal for a fake BMF belt. Absolute insanity. It's another big paycheck against Jorge Masvidal at UFC 244. I actually went live and watched this fight at Madison Square Garden. He loses via doctor stoppage, but we all know when Nate Diaz loses, his cult-like following doesn't even care. They say, oh, well, if they would have went 5 rounds, he would have came back and won. That's besides the point. Then he sits out for another year and a half. The inactivity of Nate Diaz because he's having issues with the UFC. And it's just, whether it's Nate Diaz's fault or the UFC's fault, it's just constantly happening. And he finally comes back at UFC 263 against Leon Edwards, one of the top-ranked welterweights. And I honestly believe at this point the UFC just wanted him to lose. There's been a lot of times throughout the course of his career, I get some of these fights where, top-ranked guys and Nate Diaz, a lot of people were very high on his skills. But I believe a lot of these matchups were selected purposely because the UFC kind of didn't like Nate Diaz. They knew he was a draw, but they didn't really like him, and they wanted him to lose. But Nate Diaz accepts the fight against Leon Edwards, loses for basically 98% of the fight, clips Leon Edwards at the end of the fight, and then, that's all everyone talks about afterwards. Leon Edwards beat him up for 24 minutes. He gets rocked at the end. People act like Nate Diaz won the fight. So now we're to present day, and that last fight at UFC 263 was June of last year. So now he sat out for over a year again. And so what's really going on there? And it's one of those things where, okay, well, Nate doesn't want to fight, I guess. That's what a lot of people are saying who hate Nate. And he's been begging for fight after fight, saying he wants to fight Dustin, saying he wants to fight this guy, fight that guy. But what's really going on? The reality of the scenario is Nate Diaz is trying to fight out his UFC contract. And this is where we come to UFC contracts in general. Because if the UFC thinks they can use you to build the UFC in general, to, sell pay-per-views, they don't want you ever fighting out your contract. The UFC can sign you to a 10-fight deal and cut you after one loss. They don't care. That you can go out and make a mistake, get arrested, they can cut you. They don't care, even though you're on a 10-fight deal. But if you sign to that 10-fight deal and you want out, you're screwed. And the UFC has certain guys, Nate Diaz being one of them, who is a massive star in the company, regardless if some people want to believe it or not. And the UFC does not want Nate Diaz leaving the company. And he has one fight left on his deal. And the UFC doesn't even like to let fighters fight out to no fights. They like to re-sign them when they have 2 fights left, 1 fight left. And Nate Diaz is determined to fight out the deal. So what the UFC is doing, or was doing, is what they're trying to do is they're just trying to keep him under contract. So they're offering him new contracts. Maybe they're offering him 6-fight deals, 7-fight deals. They tend to offer, especially guys like Nate Diaz, these long contracts because there's really no downside. If Nate Diaz drops off the face of the earth and none of the fans care anymore, they can cut him after 2 fights. But if he continues to be the star that he is, they can keep him under contract. They don't want him fighting out the contract. So what I believe they're doing is they're offering him terrible matchups because they want to devalue him. We talked about this in other videos. They offered him Khamzat Chimaev because they knew Khamzat Chimaev will smash him. That is a terrible matchup for Nate Diaz. And also, the UFC is known to do this as well. Offer fights on bad timelines. They might offer you a fight 4 weeks out and say, hey, you want to fight Khamzat in 4 weeks? You're like, no, I need 5 weeks. I need 6 weeks before I fight Khamzat. And then that counts as one of your fights offered because the UFC is under obligation. Dana White says this all the time. We're under obligation to offer these guys 3 fights a year, which means send them a contract for a fight regardless of what's going on. If you turn down that fight, your contract is automatically extended. So I believe they've offered him unfavorable matchups, or they've offered him bad timelines. So basically, Nate's had to decline some of these matchups. But Nate, even admittedly by Dana White, has accepted some of these matchups, and they still haven't come to fruition. And the reason, obviously, this is all speculation. Some of it is known fact, some of it's speculation. But the reason that it doesn't really matter what their contractual obligation is because it would be a nightmare to fight the UFC in court. We've seen it with Eddie Alvarez in Bellator. Eddie Alvarez was the champion in Bellator. He fought out his contract. He signed with the UFC. Bellator said, we're matching your contract. There was a legal dispute. It went on for 2 years, and Eddie Alvarez ended up giving up and going back to Bellator for a little while before he eventually was able to get out of Bellator and make his way to the UFC because these contracts are so restrictive. And then, especially if you're a fighter and let's say you're 35. I don't even remember how old Nate is right now. And you're trying to, okay, I'm going to take the UFC to court. Well, they probably have bigger and better lawyers than you have. It's going to cost you millions to fight them in court. And even if you do win, now you spent millions of dollars and you spent 3 years that you could have spent earning money fighting them in court. So Nate Diaz is not going to do that. It's not really an option, regardless of what they're doing, playing games with the UFC contracts and whatnot. But to the point of what does Nate Diaz truly want? Because I watched this interview. He doesn't really get too specific, and it's kind of hard to decipher what Nate Diaz really wants. And this is just pure speculation on my part. I think a lot of people think this as well. But what I think Nate Diaz wants to do, and I get this is at the simplest form. Nate Diaz wants to get out of his UFC contract, and he wants to see what else is offered to him. And I believe that there's probably an offer on the table from Jake Paul of some sort to box him, because we know this would be a massive fight for Jake Paul, for Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz is a draw in the UFC. UFC doesn't want to let him go fight Jake Paul. If the UFC wants to let Nate fight Jake Paul, they want a cut of those proceeds because that's going to make a lot of money. And I believe what Nate wants to do is he wants to get out of his contract. He wants to go fight Jake Paul in the boxing ring. And let's say he beats him, because Nate Diaz believes he's going to beat him. Well, I'm not getting into a prediction here. But the point is being that if Nate Diaz beats him, what does that mean? Well, you guarantee Jake Paul's going to want a rematch. So that's 2 huge money fights for Nate Diaz. And I think that's what he wants to do. And then after that, maybe he can come back to the UFC, sign a big contract with the UFC. He's going to be more popular than ever, and maybe come back to a potential Conor McGregor fight afterwards. Because I think even if Nate leaves and goes and boxes, YouTubers, or even I also think in Nate's mind, he's thinking maybe I can get a boxing match with some of these big boxers. I mean, Conor went out and fought Mayweather. Kamaru Usman's calling out, Canelo, which is just, it's just disgusting, honestly, that these guys are having to call out boxers because they want bigger paydays. But I think Nate wants to explore his options and then maybe come back to the UFC, or maybe never come back to the UFC. But what does the UFC want? That is the real question. I believe what the UFC wants, they want to lock Nate Diaz down to a long-term deal. Nate Diaz draws in pay-per-view buys. And they don't want to risk Nate Diaz leaving on a win. Like, they don't want to, let's say he has one fight left, and let's say they want to book him against Conor McGregor towards the end of the year, which also doesn't work because of the timeline. Nate Diaz wants to fight immediately. He doesn't want to wait till November, December to fight Conor McGregor. I think the UFC wants Nate Diaz versus Conor McGregor. But the problem with that is, if Nate beats him and then leaves, Nate's going to be bigger than ever. He just devalued Conor McGregor now a little bit more. Conor McGregor's always going to be a big star regardless of how many losses he has. But you get the point. It's just not a good scenario for the UFC if Nate beats Conor and then leaves out of the UFC. It's just not going to be good for them. And that's pay-per-view money out the window for them because they probably do a fourth fight if he beat up Conor McGregor. But also, on the other hand, the UFC probably wants Nate Diaz versus Conor McGregor 3. That's been a fight that's been talked about since 2016. And you start looking at potential opponents for Conor McGregor. You look at Tony Ferguson, Michael Chandler, Charles Oliveira, Islam Makhachev, Jorge Masvidal, Nate Diaz. And you start thinking, who is Conor McGregor most likely to beat out of those names? And number one on that list is Nate Diaz. And the UFC wants to get Conor McGregor back on the winning track. And they want to get him back on the winning track against the biggest name possible. And that's going to be Nate Diaz. I believe Conor McGregor, Nate Diaz is the biggest fight the UFC can make. Maybe, just maybe, Conor McGregor versus Jorge Masvidal could do more pay-per-view buys. But I think that's a little bit more risky because I think it's less likely that Conor McGregor is able to defeat Jorge Masvidal. And then also you have a problem with Nate Diaz here because even if he fights out his deal, and I feel like a lot of people don't know this about UFC contracts, is if he does fight out his deal, the UFC not only has an exclusive negotiating clause, which means when Nate Diaz fights his last fight, let's say he gets a fight, UFC 277, July 30th. He fights his last fight. What's going to happen then after that? Nate Diaz cannot talk to any other promotion or field any other deals from anyone. I think typically it's 3 months, but I think sometimes it can be like 6 months. They cannot talk to anyone else. They're not technically a free agent. They're not signed with the UFC, but this is in their original contract. Then what happens after that? They can go to talk to anyone they want, but UFC has matching rights. So this is what happened to Eddie Alvarez. He went and signed with the UFC. Bellator is going to say, we match it, you're coming back. So essentially what that means is Nate Diaz could go sign another contract to do whatever he wants to do. And the UFC could say, you know what, we'll match that. And then Nate Diaz has to re-sign with the UFC essentially because they're giving him exactly what he signed in another deal. So it's not even going to be easy. So even if Nate gets his fight next month, it's going to be another year. If the UFC really wants to be vindictive and try to, screw with him as much as possible, it's going to be another year, even if he fights next month. And they could probably keep him away from a fight for at least another couple months before finally everything else, win or lose, Nate Diaz continues, down this negotiation path with the UFC. And then you have, and I only want to talk about this briefly because this doesn't matter too much. You have Nate Diaz and Ariel Helwani, in this interview. And what does Ariel Helwani want? Because I really believe, based on some of the things he says, and I've seen in the past, whether it be interviews, tweets, I think that Ariel Helwani wants more than anything. He wants Jake Paul versus Nate Diaz in a boxing match. And it would not surprise me if Ariel Helwani is collecting a check from Jake Paul. And I get that Ariel Helwani's been on fighter pay and all this stuff in the last year or two. He was not like that before when he worked for the UFC, when he worked for ESPN. I get it. He was trying to make a living. But I just find it a little bit distasteful. He clearly wants that. That's what he wants. And I believe Ariel Helwani knows some stuff behind the scenes. And that's why he wasn't super pushy. He asked a couple times, but he didn't really push Nate Diaz. Is that what your plans are next? Are you planning to fight Jake Paul next? It's a very odd situation because no one's willing to really come out and say, I'm not saying media. Media is talking about it. But I'm saying Nate Diaz, the UFC, Jake Paul, Ariel Helwani, all the big names, are not willing to say that's exactly what's going on here. And that's what I believe. I could be totally wrong. We'll find out. But I believe that's what's going on here. And I believe a lot of people know behind the scenes what's actually going on, and they're not coming out right out and saying it. So as far as what I think actually happens, this is really debatable because this situation can go a million different ways. But what I think will eventually happen is the UFC will probably get Nate Diaz a fight towards the end of this year, maybe the fall, maybe November. Nate Diaz is not going to be happy. I'm telling you right now. They're going to get him a fight. They're going to try to build someone else's name off of him. Now, I don't know who that may be. It's probably going to be a terrible matchup for him. For all we know, Bilal Muhammad beat Sean Brady. They book him against Bilal Muhammad, who's going to take him down and hold him down. I don't know if that's really going to be the name they want to build, but they're going to want to get some of that star power, transferred from Nate Diaz to another up-and-coming fighter. Maybe Shavkat Rakhmonov could be a name that he could potentially fight. I know this sounds crazy, but this is the way the UFC thinks. It would not shock me if they're having Khamzat Chimaev wait out for the winner of Usman versus Edwards. They could potentially do that fight later this year because Nate Diaz is fed up at this point. He said, I'll accept any fight. I accepted the Khamzat fight. Dana White even said so. And one last thing I want to touch on before I actually end this video, because this video has gone longer than I even imagined it would go. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like the video. I greatly appreciate it. But one more thing that people have been speculating about, and I think this is a very slight possibility, but I just think it will cause nothing but nightmares for Nate Diaz. People have said, you know what? The UFC has screwed around with Nate Diaz so much. He should go out there, sign the fight, go out there, tap out as soon as the referee says fight, and then just walk out of the cage. And I think this could happen. Nate Diaz is crazy enough he would do this. But I just really think it would cause so many legal issues. And Nate Diaz, even if he goes out there against a guy like Khamzat and gets absolutely ragdolled and destroyed and finished in the first round, the fans are still going to rock with Nate Diaz. He has a cult-like following. It doesn't matter how many fights he loses. It's just like Conor McGregor. No matter how many fights they lose, they're always going to have their star power. So I think that's highly unlikely. But at the end of the day, I think the UFC wants to re-sign Nate. And I think if they re-sign Nate, it's all going to be peachy keen. But I think Nate wants to figure out what's possible outside the UFC. He wants to talk to other people. He wants to get other options. And eventually the best option may be the UFC. But the UFC doesn't like to play that game because when they play that game, they end up having to pay more money to the fighter. And if Nate goes out there and gets 3 or 4 offers from other, whether it be Bellator or PFL, I doubt they could afford him. But a potential Jake Paul boxing match and pay-per-view revenue share of that. I don't think the UFC wants to go that route because then they're going to end up having to pay Nate Diaz more. But I find it hard to believe that we will only see one more fight from Nate Diaz. But if it is, please book him versus Tony Ferguson. I really would love to see Nate Diaz versus Tony Ferguson. And then he can go off and do whatever he wants to do because obviously Nate Diaz has kind of been, a little bit delusional his whole career, but all fighters are. He doesn't want to go out there. UFC's not going to book him anything but grapplers probably for the rest of his career outside of maybe Conor. And, Nate Diaz, I just really would love to see him fight Tony Ferguson before he leaves the UFC. But hopefully this isn't the end of Nate Diaz. I always enjoy seeing him in there. I understand that he's not championship caliber at this point in his career, but there's still a lot of fun fights for Nate Diaz in the UFC. The Conor trilogy, the Tony Ferguson fight, I'm sure you could find a couple other fights, maybe a Jorge Masvidal rematch that would all be very fun for Nate Diaz in a final fight. But let me know what you guys think about all this down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.